All right, everyone, get ready for a deep dive on something pretty unsettling, a recent E. coli outbreak. And it's tied to McDonald's quarter pounders. Yeah, we're talking one death, dozens hospitalized, across 10 states. Definitely serious stuff. To break it all down, we've got reports from NPR and the CDC, plus some extra insights from the Cleveland Clinic.
What's really concerning here is the specific type of E. coli. It's not just any regular one. We're dealing with E. coli 0157H7, and this strain is, well, it's notorious, especially for causing serious complications, particularly in young children and the elderly. Think kidney failure.
Wow, so right away we know this is not something to take lightly, and NPR reports show that Colorado and Nebraska seem to be hit the hardest. It's good to hear that McDonald's is taking action, though. They pulled quarter pounders from the menu in the affected states,
Yeah.
and they halted distribution of the suspect onions.
That quick response is critical. These E. coli infections, especially with this strain, they can escalate so fast. Like 1 minute you're fine, the next you're doubled over with intense stomach cramps, and then, well, let's just say things get pretty unpleasant.
Okay, so severe symptoms are definitely on the table here. The Cleveland Clinic explainer really emphasizes that this E. coli 0157 Manti 787 is not something to mess with.
Mm.
But before we get into all the outbreak specifics, I think it would be helpful to kind of zoom out for a second. Can you walk us through what exactly makes this particular strain so dangerous compared to the others?
Absolutely. So E. coli is actually a pretty big group of bacteria. Most strains are harmless, really, just kind of hanging out in our gut, helping with digestion, that kind of thing. But then you've got these like rogue strains, like 0157.H7, and those produce what are called Shiga toxins. And those toxins are the real problem. They cause inflammation and damage to the lining of your intestines. That's what leads to those really bad symptoms.
So it's not just the bacteria itself, it's the toxins they produce that wreak havoc. And in this case, it seems like the likely culprit is contaminated onions.
That's what the CDC's preliminary findings point to, yeah. But the investigation is still going on, though. It's just a good reminder that contamination can happen anywhere, really, from the farm to processing to distribution, any point in that food supply chain.
That's a little unnerving to think about. This outbreak makes me think about all those past E. coli scares, the ones involving spinach, romaine lettuce. Produce seems to be a common culprit. Why is that?
Well, produce is just more vulnerable to contamination because it's often eaten raw, right? With meat, you cook it to a safe temperature. That kills off a lot of the bad stuff. But with produce, you don't always have that extra step. So contamination can happen during growing, harvesting, processing, even at the grocery store, or even in our own kitchens. And like we've seen, even a tiny amount of contamination can have massive consequences.
Yeah, this is where those hand washing reminders suddenly feel very real. Speaking of which, the Cleveland Clinic explainer mentioned that hand washing is the single most effective way to stop E. coli from spreading. Can you explain why that is?
Sure. So the most common way E. coli spreads is what's called the fecal-oral route. Basically,
Yeah.
microscopic amounts of fecal matter can get onto our hands, surfaces, and then eventually into our mouths. I know it sounds gross, but it's a reality. So washing your hands thoroughly, especially after using the bathroom and handling raw food, is just crucial.
Okay, so hand washing is our first line of defense. But what about other precautions? I'm guessing washing fruits and vegetables is also super important,
Yeah,
even if they come pre-washed in those bags.
you got it. Never assume pre-washed produce is totally safe. Give it a good rinse under running water, especially leafy greens, because bacteria can hide in all those little nooks and crannies.
Makes sense. So we've talked about the dangers of the strain, how it spreads, some basic precautions. But now I think it's time for the not so fun part, the symptoms. What can people actually expect if they've been infected with this E. coli 0157H7?
Well, like we've mentioned, the symptoms are often severe, and they can come on pretty suddenly. We're talking intense stomach cramps, the kind that make you just want to curl up in a ball, and then diarrhea, often bloody, nausea and vomiting too.
Oh, wow, that sounds absolutely awful. And on top of that, you mentioned earlier that this strain can lead to kidney problems.
Yes, that's the real danger here. This E. coli can cause something called hemolytic uremic syndrome, HUS for short. It affects the blood and blood vessels, can lead to kidney damage, even failure, and it's life-threatening.
So it's not just the initial infection we need to worry about. There's the potential for long-term consequences, too. This is definitely a situation where getting medical help is critical. But before we talk about treatment and prevention, let's break down this HUS complication a bit more. Can you explain how exactly this E. coli leads to HUS?
Of course. So, remember those Shiga toxins we talked about? While sometimes those toxins get into the bloodstream and attack the kidneys, they damage the tiny blood vessels in there, leading to clots, and then eventually kidney failure. And HUS is especially dangerous for young children, the elderly, anyone with a weakened immune system.
This is some scary stuff.
Yeah.
It really makes you realize how important it is to take this outbreak seriously. And I imagine early detection is key when it comes to preventing HUS.
Absolutely. The sooner treatment starts, the better the chances of preventing those serious complications. We'll talk more about treatment in the next part, but for now, it's just vital to understand how serious this is. E. coli 0157 by H7 is not something to take lightly.
Okay, so we've talked about the dangers of this specific E. coli strain, how it spreads, the symptoms, and that potentially life-threatening complication, HUS. It's a lot to take in, but knowledge is power, right? Yeah. In the next part of our deep dive, we'll discuss what to do if you think you've been infected, different treatment options, and additional steps you can take to protect yourself and your family. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, I guess we didn't really go anywhere. It's a podcast. But before we move on to the next part of our E. coli conversation, we were talking about the really nasty symptoms, if you get infected with this bad strain. And those symptoms are definitely nothing to ignore.
Exactly. And we are talking about possible kidney failure and other serious complications, so recognizing those signs early is really, really important.
So let's say someone thinks they might have gotten exposed to this E. coli 0157.H7. What should they be on the lookout for? Besides, well, the digestive issues.
Right. Besides the cramps and diarrhea, which can be pretty bad and often bloody, watch out for signs of dehydration, like increased thirst, dry mouth, not peeing as often, fatigue, maybe dizziness. And for young kids, just look for fewer wet diapers.
And are those all reasons to get medical help right away?
Absolutely. Don't try to just wait it out, especially for young children, older folks, or anyone with a weakened immune system. Early treatment is key.
Got it. So say someone does see a doctor. What should they expect for treatment? The Cleveland Clinic explainer said that antibiotics aren't always recommended.
That's important, yeah. Antibiotics work great for a lot of bacterial infections, but for E. coli 0157.H7, they can actually be harmful.
Harmful? How so?
Well, antibiotics can actually make it more likely to develop HUS, that serious complication we discussed. That's because some antibiotics cause the bacteria to release even more Shiga toxins, those proteins that can hurt the kidneys.
Wow, that seems counterintuitive. So if you don't use antibiotics, what is the normal treatment for this kind of E. coli infection?
Treatment is usually about managing the symptoms and supporting the body's own defenses. Things like rest, lots of fluids to fight that dehydration, and over-the-counter meds for fever and pain. In severe cases, you might need to go to the hospital for IV fluids and to monitor for those complications.
So it's mostly about supportive care, letting the body do its thing and fight it off, and hopefully stopping those worst complications.
Exactly. And while we've been focusing on this McDonald's outbreak, you have to remember that you can get this E. coli from lots of places. Contaminated produce, undercooked meat, unpasteurized milk, juices, even contact with infected animals can all be risky.
It really makes you think about food safety, doesn't it? At home and when you're eating out. I think what's really scary about all this is the potential for long-term problems. We've already discussed HUS and kidney damage. Are there other possible long-term effects of an E. coli 0157.H7 infection?
That's a good question. HUS is definitely the most well-known and dangerous complication, but you can have other issues that linger. Some people get what's called post-infectious irritable bowel syndrome, or IBS. That can cause long-term abdominal pain, bloating, and changes in bowel habits. And in rare cases, you can even have neurological problems.
So even if you get over the initial infection, you might not be totally in the clear. It really emphasizes how important prevention is.
Couldn't agree more. It all goes back to the basics. Proper hand washing, thoroughly cooking meat, careful handling of raw foods, being aware of where contamination could be coming from.
This whole deep dive has made me rethink those times I didn't wash my hands well enough, or maybe didn't cook that burger all the way through. It's a real wake-up call.
It shows how even little things can impact our health. We can't get rid of every risk, but we can definitely take steps to reduce them.
Right. Well, I think we've covered a lot in this part. We've discussed how important it is to recognize symptoms early, the problems with antibiotics in some cases, the supportive care that's usually used, and those possible long-term health problems.
We've also pointed out the many ways you can get infected with this E. coli 0157.H7, and that just reinforces how important food safety is.
In our last segment, we'll look at this outbreak from a broader perspective, and we'll talk about more things you can do to protect yourself and your loved ones. Stick around. All right, we're back for the last part of our deep dive into this E. coli outbreak. We've talked about those yucky symptoms and the possibility of things lasting even after you recover. But now, I want to kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture. What can we really learn from all this, and how can we use that to protect ourselves better in the future?
That's a really important question. This outbreak is definitely scary, but it's not like it's totally out of the blue. We've seen similar outbreaks over the past few years, tied to all sorts of things: romaine lettuce, ground beef. It shows you just how fragile our food system can be and how important it is to always be careful.
It can feel a little overwhelming, to be honest. Like, how are we supposed to keep track of all the possible risks?
I know what you mean. But the thing is, every outbreak, as bad as it is, teaches us something new. It makes people investigate, leads to stricter rules, and ultimately helps make the system stronger. Like, remember that big E. coli outbreak from spinach back in 2006? That led to some big changes in how spinach is grown, harvested, and processed. And it's a lot safer now because of it.
So it's kind of a constant process of learning and adapting. We can't get rid of all the risks, but we can at least make things safer as we go.
Exactly. And it's not all about government rules and what the food industry does. It's about us, too, consumers. We're part of this whole thing. If we're careful about food safety in our own kitchens, stay informed about the risks, and make smart choices about what we eat, we can really lower our chances of getting sick.
Okay, so let's talk about those things we can do ourselves. We already mentioned the basics: hand washing, cooking meat all the way through, washing produce really well. Are there any other things, maybe less obvious, that can help?
Oh, definitely. One thing that people forget about sometimes is cross-contamination. Make sure you're using separate cutting boards and knives for raw meat and produce.
Wow.
Don't let those meat juices get anywhere near your ready-to-eat stuff. And when you're at the store, think about how you're putting things in your cart and bags. Keep raw meat away from other things, especially produce.
That's a good point. I've definitely been guilty of tossing a package of ground beef right on top of my lettuce at the store. Oops.
We've all done it. Another thing is food storage. Is your fridge set to the right temperature? 40 degrees or lower. And don't cram it full of stuff. You need air to circulate so it can stay cold enough. And pay attention to those expiration dates. Don't push it with stuff that goes bad quickly, especially meat and poultry.
All good advice. It's amazing how a few little habits can make such a big difference. Like, we've got this whole system set up to keep food safe, but it's up to each of us to make sure it's actually working.
That's right. We can't just take it for granted that everything's always safe. We got to be part of keeping our food safe.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the big takeaway? What do you really want our listeners to remember?
I want them to remember that knowledge is power. If we understand the risks, know where contamination might come from, and use those simple but important safety tips, we can really reduce our chances of getting E. coli and other foodborne illnesses. It's not about being afraid, it's about being informed and in control.
Well said. And I think that's exactly what this deep dive has done. It's given us the information to make smarter choices. And remember, everyone, this isn't just about you, it's about your family and friends too. Little kids, older folks, they're more likely to get those really bad complications. So let's all do our part to keep each other safe.
Absolutely. We all have a role to play in food safety. If we work together, we can make things better.
Okay, that's it for our deep dive on this E. coli outbreak. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and stay healthy.